Now we have the S&P in a position, in a very narrow trading range, but in a position to give a signal if we break 2280.
Hello Bruno, it's great to see you again. Thanks for coming back in.
Good morning, Jack.
And so to get started, 2 weeks ago you mentioned a new high for the S&P 500. What is going on?
Well, there is some issue. S&P 500 is facing some headwind and maybe we have a potential top. Let's look at a strange pattern which occurred over the last 2 weeks on the S&P 500. You see here you had a big gap up, a kind of 3 days at a high, and then a gap down, and that's called an island reversal. Usually it signals a top. And what we see is that it went down 2 days, and then the whole pattern failed, and it moved back up. And now it moved back up to the levels just below 2300, but it doesn't go through. So again, it's failing. So now we need to be careful and aware that the VIX, the volatility, is not making lower low, it's just a bit higher. And there is a risk really if we move below that levels. So the S&P is facing headwinds.
So where do these headwinds come from?
That's a good question. Usually there is an opportunity to look at the ratio of the defensive sector versus the cyclical sectors. Cyclicals is represented by XLY and defensive by the staples XLP here. When there is the ratio which is going down, that means that defensive sector is outperforming, and usually that corresponds a little bit to a kind of a correction. That's what has happened over the last 2 weeks. It's clearly a little bit more defensive than cyclical, and that's usually calling for a correction.
So which defensive sector was it that outperformed?
The first sector which outperformed the best was healthcare. The beginning of, in the last 2 weeks, we just moved up sharply. The relative strength rebounded quickly. But now we notice that it is really at just below a former resistance. So with momentum which is a little bit overbought, it's probably going to go more sideways.
So what about staples?
Staples, you're right, are the other big sector, defensive sector. And here we've got a bit more dynamic patterns with higher highs and higher lows. Also, the relative strength is rebounding. So that means that the market is looking for a safe place to go.
Mm-hmm. And but is technology not at a new high?
That's a very good point. Technology is, in fact, the only sector which is holding the whole market. It is rising on a relative strength versus the S&P 500. It's also making higher highs and higher lows. And there, we need to be a little bit more going detail. Look here at this momentum here. We are just reaching the previous high, but not making a higher highs, while on the price action, we are making a higher highs. In fact, the momentum is discretely, slowly slowing down. And that means that we need to be very careful if we are breaking this trend support, because this last holding sector could then not be there anymore and the correction could start.
So is the pause in the rise of long-term rates also an issue for the financial sector?
Yes, you're right. Financial used to be helpful, and as we see here for the interest rates, it's a long drawing trading range, slow. It's probably not yet fully oversold, and it could drift a little bit more, not much, but probably in direction of 230. We are now 239. And of course, in that case, the financial sector is not benefiting much. And you see clearly on the financial sector, since mid-December, every time we hit the highs, the resistance, it fails, and big black down candles, and probably it's again what happened yesterday, and suggesting more sideways or a little bit more down. So of course also that sector is not helping the S&P 500.
So is the technical picture not better in Japan?
Well, we look at these different geographical area, and one of the things that we would like to see to answer by a yes would be a relative strength which would be rising. On the contrary, that's not what we see here. We see the relative strength is coming down, and again in the end of January and again now in February. So Here there is no help. It's still in a long trading range, and in addition, technically, we enter this area, green area, which is the so-called cloud. That means that basically we go from an uptrend when prices are above the clouds to probably an area where we could consolidate it even more. So now the signal is more corrective.
So is this also the case for Europe?
This is unfortunately also the case for Europe, and we are going to enter the cloud in a similar fashion, and with again also relative strength versus S&P 500, which is clearly making lower lows.
And so are the emerging markets the only place where we are seeing a strong uptrend?
Well, with all these developments, and especially on interest rates, many people have been expecting the emerging market to slow down. In fact, since the beginning of December, it's really the reverse which is happening. Probably people were taking on the wrong foot. We do have a rising, for example, India is making higher highs, breaking a resistance, also on the relative strengths, going up versus the S&P 500, and also taking some leadership versus the emerging market. That's the orange line, which is also rising. So here it's still doing okay, but we need to remember emerging markets are high beta. And if there is a correction in the S&P, then that means it could be tough there. If we look, for example, at China, the situation is not as bullish as it looks like. You see here a trading range. Instead of being above the big resistance, it's still below, and the momentum is coming down. Relative strength is not rising, but just flat. And the other market that we looked at is Brazil, also a flat relative strength versus the S&P 500. And still also below a key resistance, so the risk of a pullback is important. So in conclusion, really what we need to think is that now we have the S&P in a position, in a very narrow trading range, but in a position to give a signal if we break 2280. So that's really the key levels to remember for the coming 2 weeks. If it breaks, it comes down. If not, maybe we can go further, a little bit marginally higher, but not much, I believe.
Bruno, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
And thank you for watching. And remember, Bruno is here every 2 weeks, so make sure to click back. Goodbye.